Yes, we are on live. Halo semua, salam sejahtera kepada semua Sabahan dan Sarawakian. Pada hari ini, saya bersama dengan Encik Robert mengambil inisiatif untuk memulakan aktiviti ataupun program mendekati rakyat melalui perkongsian informasi tentang perkara-perkara yang perlu diketahui oleh semua Sabahan dan Sarawakian. So, di sini kami akan mengemukakan ataupun akan menyentuh 3 persoalan yang perlu diketahui, yang perlu difahami oleh semua pihak. Pertama ialah apakah perbezaan negara dan koloni. Kedua, apakah status North Borneo dan Sarawak sebelum tahun 1963, dan yang ketiga, apakah kapasiti Sabah dan Sarawak untuk melakukan perjanjian antarabangsa bersama dengan UK dan juga Malaya. Okey, saya juga akan menggunakan dua bahasa. Saya lebih kepada menterjemahkan bahasa dari English ke bahasa yang bahasa Malaysia supaya anda semua mampu memahaminya. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, today's we are having a live video with Mr. Robert and me myself. We are going. We will be having an information session on the differences between a state and colony, and afterward we will be discuss about the status of North Borneo and Sarawak for 1963. And the last one we will be talking about a question about our capacity of making a binding agreement with UK and Malaya. So without any delay, we will start with the first question. So I will let Mr. Robert to take in charge.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to talk more about the meaning, the differences between a state and a colony. And before I go into that, I'd like to briefly recap what has happened since 2013 and 14 when we started the campaign to raise awareness on issues relating to the Malaysia Agreement 1963 or MA63. At the beginning, when we had forums about the Malaysia Agreement and questioned the validity of this international agreement, it created a sudden awareness among many people that for so many years they have not been able to get clear ideas about what the Malaysia Agreement was about. So since that time, the awareness has spread throughout northern Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak, and to the Peninsula Malaysia. And practically almost every day in the news, we can see now people, articles and news about MA63. And significantly, because of the effort in raising awareness, in around 2016, the new Chief Minister of Sarawak, Adnan Satem, began to campaign for Sarawak rights based on the breaches of the Malaysia Agreement. And this gave a lot of encouragement to activists who saw it as a signal to increase their campaign on MA63, and during that time there were numerous public awareness campaign, public rallies, and right down to the end of 2019, the people were very active until a lot of actions were slowed down by COVID-19. However, we like to say that we have continued our campaign on the internet, and we believe that as a result of the pressure on this issue, the federal and the state government in Sabah and Sarawak have seriously taken up the demand that the breaches of MA63 be rectified. Part of our campaign has been to show that the Malaysia Agreement was not a valid treaty, and an important international law case, which was decided by the International Court of Justice, confirmed our assertion that in 1963, neither Sabah, Sarawak, or even Singapore had the power or the capacity to make a binding agreement with independent states like the United Kingdom and Malaya. So we are now confident that we actually have a case from the United Nations Court that supports our assertion. However, there still have been quite a lot of misunderstanding about how this principle of capacity works. Basically, the principle affirmed by the International Court of Justice says that only independent states are capable of making binding international agreements with each other. And this principle has been applied for a long time, and then it became codified in 1969 in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And prior to that, the principle was laid down in the Montevideo Convention on the rights and duties of states. So today, I made some notes on the question of the difference between a state and a colony. This is to enable people to understand better why a colony is not able to make an international agreement. The important stage of development in the international law took place in 1933, when the standard definition of a state under international law was established by the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. It was an agreement signed in South America with a number of South American states, but since then, the definition has become accepted by most countries in the world. The convention adopted the following definition: that stipulates or says that all states were equal sovereign units consisting of a permanent population, defined territorial boundaries, a government, and an ability to enter into agreements with other states. So, in the definition of a state, it was agreed that only states have an ability or capacity to enter into agreements with other states. And so the definition I would summarize again is that the state as a person of international law should possess the following qualifications. A permanent population, a defined territory, government, and 4, capacity to enter into relations with other states. And this includes making international agreements. So, what were the status of North Borneo or Sabah and Sarawak in 1933? Well, in 1933, Sarawak was an independent state, whereas North Borneo or Sabah was very much a colony in status. And what's the difference between the two? Well, Sarawak being an independent state from 1841 to 1941 was able to make treaties with other states as an independent country, whereas North Borneo was under the rule of the North Borneo Chartered Company, and it was a protectorate of the United Kingdom at the time. So it was more or less a colony ruled by a British governor at the time. And the difference is that as a colony, North Borneo would have no power to make international agreements. Well, now the other things that distinguish a state from a colony is that a colony may have certain features like a permanent population, a defined territory. However, the government is not one that is controlled by the people, but controlled by a foreign government who has all the powers to make laws and rules that govern the country. So if we fast forward to 1946, at the time, the British had just came out of World War II, and they had proposed to form the Malayan Union. And this union was to include the territories of independent Sarawak, North Borneo, and Brunei. However, the proposal was rejected by the Brooke government in 1946, and the British then proceeded to create the Malayan Union without Sabah and Sarawak and Brunei. But nevertheless, the British, in line with their plans to create such a union, basically to consolidate their colonial interest in the Southeast Asian region, they proceeded to annex North Borneo and Sarawak as crown colonies. So now we come to the question of what is a crown colony? A crown colony is a British overseas territory under the direct authority of the British Crown. As such, a crown colony does not possess its own uh, representative government and is not represented in the British Parliament. I'm reading from my notes. The colony is administered by a governor appointed by the Crown and responsible to the Colonial Office in London. So, in other words, when Sarawak as an independent state was annexed as a British Crown colony and along with Sabah, the Sarawak government was no longer in the hands of an independent state, but it was controlled by the British government as a crown colony. And so that was the status of Sabah and Sarawak in 1946 to 1963. And in the 1960s, the British revived the idea of consolidating their strategic military interest in Southeast Asia, which they had began with the formation of the Malayan Union. And having failed in 1946, they revived it in 1960, and that had first envisaged the Union as a loose confederation of independent states. However, the idea was proposed to the Malayan government in secret, and they had secret discussions. And the Malayan government insisted that instead of such a confederate arrangement, they would prefer to have Sabah and Sarawak and also Brunei become states of Malaya. So after long negotiations, the British agreed with the Malayan idea to absorb or integrate the Borneo territories into the Malayan Federation. So I have hopefully come to the hopefully been able to give a better idea on the status of Sabah and Sarawak, and finally, in 1963, the British created the Malaysia Agreement to facilitate the integration of Sabah, Sarawak, and Brunei into the Malayan Federation. And the issue of whether Sabah and Sarawak were capable of being parties to the agreement arose and was debated by the British government. And the Attorney General of Hello?
Yes, is everything all right?
Did we lose power?
No, all good, all good. Please
Oh,
proceed.
still going because I thought the power cut off. I'm sorry.
No, all good.
Well, anyway, sorry for the interruption. Basically, what I was saying is that in 1963, the British government decided to create the Federation of Malaysia, which from their original idea of a confederation, it was changed into a federation whereby the Borneo territories of Sabah and Sarawak, and then the independent state of Brunei were to be integrated as part of the Federation of Malaya. Now, I was saying that the issue of whether Sabah and Sarawak were capable of being parties in the agreement was raised by the British government, and it was acknowledged that they were not sovereign states. In other words, they were not independent, as they were crown colonies. So they had no capacity to make a binding agreement with the UK or with Malaya. And nevertheless, the British and the Malayan governments decided to proceed with the agreement, and they included Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore as signatory parties. And the agreement was signed on the 9th of July, 1963. At the time of signing, both Sabah and Sarawak were still crown colonies. And it was my conclusion in 2013 that this situation was not legal, in the sense that the Malaysia agreement was not legally or lawfully made because it had breached the principles of international law on making treaties. So this issue was raised, has been raised since 2013, and it is being continuously raised why the Malaysian federal government and the state governments of Sabah and Sarawak have acknowledged that the Malaysia agreement, which we qualify if valid, has been breached. So the issue of the breaches of the agreement, I think we can talk about in another session. But I think let me sum up again why the two territories were not states but colonies and were not capable of making any international treaties. In summary, according to the standard definition of a state under international law, established by the Montevideo Convention, a state is defined as a person of international law possessing the following qualifications: A permanent population; B, a defined territory; C, government; and D, capacity to enter into relations with other states. Well, that concludes my short talk on the difference between a state and a colony. Thank you.
All right, brother. All right,
Right.
Mr. Robert, thank you for the sharing, for the information. So we we're kind of wondering, because based on your um, sharing about the invalidity of Malaysia agreement, so what is actually the Sabah state government and Sarawak state government is doing? If they aware of this case, why they still um, proceed fighting this, invalid agreement? What is your comment about it?
Well, firstly, the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion, confirm or affirm the principle that only sovereign states have capacity or are competent to make binding international agreements. The fact that Sabah and Sarawak were colonies was actually confirmed by Article 1 of the Malaysia Agreement. So it is very obvious to everyone at the time of signing that they were not capable of being parties to the agreement. And the British and the Malayan government knew about it. So from that point of view, they were committing a fraud. And a fraud would invalidate the agreement itself, you see, despite notwithstanding that the agreement was already invalid by virtue of the fact that three of the parties were colonies and not sovereign states. The question is why they are continuing to uphold an invalid treaty. Well, of course, they won't admit that the treaty was invalid from the beginning, because that means they acknowledge Malaysia was unlawfully created, and therefore what it means, according to the Chagos case, Sabah and Sarawak would have to be properly decolonized. So this is the ultimate conclusion they can only draw, even if we argue that if the Malaysia agreement was valid, we would know that it has been terminated by multiple breaches, since 1958. Since Singapore exited from Malaysia, the agreed component structure of Malaysia was destroyed. That means supposed to be four countries comprising the Federation of Malaysia. But if one leaves, that means the fundamental structure of the Federation has been destroyed. And if they didn't properly enter into another agreement, the Federation of Malaysia without Singapore is not what we agreed on. So in other words, Sabah and Sarawak are unlawfully held by the Malayan government within the Federation of Malaysia. And
All right.
yeah.
Thank you for your response. And I have this one question. Is Malaysia is actually a new country? What is your comment about it?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
My question is Malaysia a new country that was formed in 1963? What is your
Yes.
comment about it?
Recently, we have been talking about that. Yeah. Well, I've made notes on that particular issue. Whether Malaysia was a new country? The answer is a straight no. And
what's the reason?
I mean, actually, I make a number of notes. Let me just refer to them.
Because based on the reading,
My
when
memory.
Pardon?
I say my memory is not very good, so I need to refer to the notes.
I see. Okay. Based on the
Yeah.
reading.
Okay. Let me firstly say there definitely was no new country created, because the reason is that the United Nations, in endorsing Malaysia, it was just endorsing a change of name from the Federation of Malaysia, Malaya, to Malaysia, name change on the 16th of September 1963. What happened was, originally the proposal was to form a federation. That was the representations made to Sabah and Sarawak, that they were forming a new federation comprising of 4 or 5 countries, including Brunei, and then Brunei dropped out. So the final result was only 4 countries forming the federation. However, the issue that arose then was that because the idea was opposed as a neo-colonial creation, which was to deny the people of Sabah and Sarawak real independence. And the governments of Indonesia and the Philippines were some of the strongest opponents of the idea, because they said that if Malaysia was to be created, they must comply with the United Nations Resolution 1541, so that the so-called new federation would have a legal basis, which was confirmed by obtaining the free and informed consent of the North Borneo and Sarawak people by way of a referendum. So that was actually the real legal issue that was raised. Without the free consent of the people given in the referendum, Malaysia couldn't be said to be lawfully created. However, to avoid the international criticisms, the British adopted the strategy of changing the name of Malaysia and then incorporating Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore into the federation. So, according to the United Nations legal opinion, a change of name is acceptable because many countries change their names, and however, they still remain the same country, because legally they were still the same, nothing had changed except they just changed the name. So in that sense, when the Malayan Federation changed its name to Malaysia on the 16th of September, no new nation was created. And all what happened was that they just admitted 3 new members. So in other words, you take the example of a company. Your company is called ABC, and then you change it to ABCD, and you
well, you allow 3 more members to come in after they were giving shares or whatever you do with, in buying, in joining a company. So in other words, the company merely changed its name, but it's still the same structures, the same company. So it can be seen in that they retain the Malayan Constitution, 1957 Constitution, and they merely amended the Constitution with special or extra rights given to Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore, so as to induce them uh, to agree to give up their the right to independence and agree with the idea of federation. So hope that answers your question.
I see. And another question. So, I mean, it's not another question. It's just that what is there for us to celebrate on the September 16th if it's no new country was formed at the time? So it's like we are celebrating Malaya rebranding its name to Malaysia.
Very
Is that
correct.
all purpose?
However, you will notice that even though after rebranding their name, the so-called Malaysia Day was never celebrated in the peninsula until 2012.
Exactly.
Hang on, no, 2016.
2019.
Well, it was around that time, yeah, 2012, 13, 16. But it shows that um, the change of name was not even celebrated or acknowledged. And at the same time, the Malaysia Agreement also is not acknowledged by the Federal Constitution. So in other words, the question has come up whether, Sabah, Sarawak are legally in Malaysia, since without the Malaysia Agreement, there would be no Malaysia. And this has become a big issue for since 2016, when the MA63 breaches of MA63 issues were being so-called discussed with between the federal and the states, 2 states governments. So it has almost been going 5 years since the discussion started, and yet nothing has come out of it. And not only that, the so-called report, the MA63 report, has been prevented from being released as a state secret. So in other words, they have some big issues they don't want to let us know. And we can only guess that these are issues which they cannot solve immediately. And well, again, we can talk about that in another session. It shows that the idea or the concept of Malaysia has changed since Singapore left in 1965. And it began to change in 1970 when they implemented the new economic policy. And the idea of race, religion, supremacy has been enforced. And this, again, is a very fundamental breach of the concept of Malaysia as agreed in 1963, which was to be a secular, multicultural system. So all these things we perhaps have to spend more time to discuss in the future, and to engage the public to discuss these issues. more widely.
All right. There's one question from the public. Since Singapore and out from Malaysia, why the agreement still go on but not automatically cancelled? What say you about it?
Yes, as I mentioned that in 1965, the Malaysia Agreement was broken by Singapore exit because it destroyed the basis of 4 countries making up the Federation of Malaysia. Well, this is the idea given to us, right? Although the real thing was more the integration of the new members into the Federation of Malaya with a name change. If the Malaysia Agreement was valid, then obviously it has been terminated by the willful multiple breaches since 1965. So unless we have time, I think maybe we should talk about that next session. What do you reckon?
All right, then. We will bring this topic to our next session then. Okay, and what else question that available here? Well, in your personal opinion, how Sabah and Sarawak can proceed with their determination to free their country from this so-called colonization from Malaysia? Briefly, generally.
Yeah. According to the decision or conclusion of the International Court of Justice in the Chagos Islands case, the British had unlawfully transferred the sovereignty of a part of the Mauritius territory to the UK in 1965. And the court found that the United Kingdom must proceed to decolonize the Chagos. Well, in my opinion, in the case of Sabah and Sarawak, the sovereignty of these 2 territories were unlawfully transferred to Malaya for the reason that, firstly, the Malaysia Agreement was now in void. Secondly, the process of making the Malaysia Agreement was unlawful because it was in breach of United Nations decolonization rules. For example, the agreement was negotiated and signed without elected representatives from Sabah and Sarawak. It was in fact negotiated by the colonial governments and the colonial attorney general even signed on behalf of Sabah and Sarawak in 1963. The other point was that the Malaysia Agreement was made during a situation of emergency where the environment was not free, where people were put in a state of fear and coercion, and so there was no free and voluntary decision made on the question of Malaysia. For example, the fact that Sabah and Sarawak did not have power to make a treaty implies that they did not, or they were not legally consenting to the treaty. And this is a point which is brought up by the International Court of Justice in the Chagos case. So for those reasons, Malaysia is just a de facto state, de facto in the sense that despite the illegality of the Malaysia Agreement, Malaya is has been put in control of Sabah and Sarawak by the British government, and it has been, in that sense, the British had unlawfully transferred the sovereignty of Sabah and Sarawak to Malaya. Further, because the British and Malayan government had failed to comply with the terms of the Manila Accord, which required that a referendum be held in Sabah and Sarawak to confirm the people's wishes on whether they wish to agree or disagree with Malaysia. And secondly, the resolution of the Philippines claim on Sabah was never resolved. So on both accounts, the formation of Malaysia was also made without proper legal basis because of the failure to comply with the Manila Accord Treaty made in 1963.
I see. Okay, there's one more interesting question that I wish to highlight from Beatrice Peter. She want to know your comment. Obviously, there are so many breaches and wrong here and there when we talk about MS-63, which by right it was already null and void. But here we are, Sabah and Sarawak internationally known as Malaysia, Sabah. Sabah and Sarawak have been operating for more than 50 years as Malaysia internationally without any official or significant resistance from these two entities. Can it be said that Malaysian Federation is made valid by conduct? What is your opinion
Well,
about?
that has always been a argument raised that the people have agreed with Malaysia, and therefore they accept it. Let me put it this way. Firstly, I mentioned the breaches of the Manila Agreement, which failed to hold a referendum, and this issue was raised again by Indonesia and the Philippines when a peace treaty was made in 1966 with the then Malaysia to end confrontation, which is actually provoked and escalated because the British and Malayan government failed to comply with the Manila Accord. So it is a bit of an irony that when they make the peace treaty, the only requirement, actually the only term stated was that the Malaysian government must hold an election to allow the people of Sabah and Sarawak to express their view and to confirm their decision on Malaysia. So you can see that since 1966, there have been no referendum held, because if you want to ask the people to confirm their decision on Malaysia, and a normal election is not a referendum. Only a referendum can gauge the people's wishes precisely, because it is an actual vote on the question of do you want Sabah and Sarawak to remain in Malaysia, or do you want them to exit for independence? This is how the vote should be done, and it was never done anyway in 1963. So the question is, does it mean that the people of Sabah and Sarawak agree with Malaysia because they voted for the BN for over the last 58 years? So now, if we look at the last 58 years, until 2012, the country was still under emergency law. After Malaysia was formed under emergency conditions, it was ruled under emergency laws until 2012. So in the context of this situation, how can you say that people, in any case could openly resist or oppose the idea of Malaysia? Because in those years, people were just simply jailed if they dare to say anything against Malaysia, and we all know about the dreaded Internal Security Act, or ISA, which was used to jail many thousands of people. And further, since 1962, after the Brunei uprising against Malaysia, people in Sarawak carried out an armed struggle against Malaysia up to 1990. So from that point of view, people were still fighting against the idea. So it's not, that means people were still not agreeing with it. So in answer to that question, people
Has been silent.
Yeah, were not able to openly speak up for fear of official suppression, which happened frequently. I mean, we know that in Sabah, some politicians were detained without trial for a few years because they talk about the breaches of the Malaysia Agreement. And for the common people, it was even more fearsome, if they were detained, they had no rights. And so this was a situation of fear and emergency rule until 2012. From that point of view, there was not an atmosphere of a free country, and the elections were well known for being rigged. So that's how the Barisan National Government was able to remain in power up till 2018. And again, because of the maneuvering in the background, the same party has come back into power again, and now they are actually openly destroying the concept of Malaysia as it was agreed to in 1963 for a secular and multicultural state. They want to turn it into a race religion state. And we can see that they don't respect minority views. They don't respect the principle of freedom, nor do they respect the concept of Malaysia, which was supposedly agreed to in 1963. So if people feel that they still agree with Malaysia, they will have to ignore all these things. And especially in Sabah, people have now openly come out to talk about independence, which means that a lot of people have overcome their fear.
We must overcome the fear.
Yeah. So it is important. People no longer accept Malaysia. They want independence. And the reasons are all provided by the wrongful actions of the federal government in suppressing the rights of minorities, in seizing the natural resources of Sabah and Sarawak, especially oil and gas. And on top of that, failing to carry out the objective of forming Malaysia, as Tunku Abdul Rahman said, was to develop Sabah and Sarawak. Instead, they taken their resources to develop Malaya and kept Sabah and Sarawak as the poorest parts of Malaysia. So can anyone say we agree with Malaysia? I mean,
Awesome.
based on all those issues, the so-called Borneo Highway has taken 50 years and they're still trying to finish it.
That's a joke,
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean,
Yes. There's one more thing that I wish to ask you. You know, like you said before, in order to get independent, we have to go through referendum, right? So when we look at Singapore, they gain their independence through separation. Is that one of the best way for Sabah and Sarawak to follow?
well,
What
let's
say
look
you?
at the way on how to get independence. Um, Referendum is just one of the ways you can peacefully gain independence, as like Scotland, they had one referendum, but they still haven't been able to go. The British, the government of the UK was more successful in doing Brexit, and they left. So basically, the right to live an association is a corollary right to the voluntary joining of an association. So in other words, when Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore agreed to form Malaysia, as the popular way of saying it, they also have the right to live, because if Malaysia was freely and voluntarily formed, then the government of Malaysia has no right to stop Sabah or Sarawak from living. That is their right. And the international law does not prevent countries from living, an association with other states, as the British have done. They left the EU after they had a referendum. It didn't have to be a majority referendum in terms of what you call two-third majority, along those lines. But still, coming back to how you can get independence, the referendum is one way. The way Singapore did it was by mutual agreement between the governments, because they couldn't work together, and they split up for similar reasons, which we are looking at today. The issue of race religion supremacy, which at the time the UMNO government refused to tone down their stand, because Lee Kuan Yew wanted to have a Malaysia, as we all know, and the UMNO party couldn't accept this idea, because they refused to share power equally with other people. So you can see this is the same idea that is floating around in Kuala Lumpur nowadays. With the new so-called new government, it has proceeded to make rules illegally, like wanting to share 51% of non-Bumiputra businesses and so on. So these are the what some people call gangster mentality. They can come and extort or hold you to ransom as they wish. A government cannot work on these principles and expect the people to be happy. So the other way is, of course, to get independence is to take control of the legislative assembly by winning the elections and getting a mandate from the people to seek independence. So any party that has such a mandate and has the majority support should be able to proceed and negotiate independence with the Malayan government.
Peacefully.
And
Yeah, I think this is how Malaya gained independence from British, because
yes,
they organize a huge, massive demonstration, and they bring down the government that paralyzed, and it forced the British to bow down to their demand. I believe the same thing. The idea is there for Sabah and Sarawak to apply as well.
well, I think the event you mentioned was in a way related to the demands for independence, but it was more, I think, to oppose the Malayan Union, which the British created in 1946. The union only lasted 2 years because of the opposition, and um, the union was actually controlled by the British. That's why I suppose the nationalists wanted independence, and eventually in 1948, the British formed the Federation of Malaysia, and in 1957 they granted independence to Malaya. So this brings us to the point, just going back to the talk on what is the difference between a state and a colony. I might just add that this issue came up in just before the proclamation of Malaysia. So in 1963, the Singapore government made its unilateral declaration of independence on the 31st of August. And on the same day, the British gave nominal self-government to Sabah and Sarawak. So this was very strongly opposed by the Malayan government because according to their secret agreement in 1962, all the 3 colonies were to be handed over to Malaya without independence. So the British, therefore, were very embarrassed, and they had to clarify that the British remained in control of Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore up till the 16th of September when they handed the sovereignty over to the Malayan government. So again, that confirmed that neither Singapore, nor Borneo or Sarawak were sovereign states on the date Malaysia Agreement was signed on the 9th of July, 1963.
I see. Okay, so this formation, after Sabah and Sarawak from Malaysia, okay, for Malaysia, question mark, are they still colony up until now?
Well, it's a good question because on the 16th of September, Sabah and Sarawak were the sovereignty of Sabah and Sarawak was transferred to Malaya. So according to Dr. Mahathir in a forum, he said, when a country gains independence, sovereignty is handed back to the people. But you see, there is a term which they used when forming Malaysia was that Sabah and Sarawak gained independence in Malaysia. Now, the good question is, this go back to our definition of a state, right? Statehood. So when Malaysia was declared on the 16th of September, what happened was that Sabah and Sarawak were merely transferred to Malaya according to the Malaysia Agreement, which says that the British sovereignty over Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore would be relinquished and vested in the Federation of Malaysia with a name change to Malaysia. So it was a straightforward process, despite they having to go through all the charade of so-called consulting the people, Cobol Commission, UN assessment. This were all just to give legitimacy to the what we believe is the annexation of Sabah and Sarawak by Malaya. So coming back to the question of the difference between a state and a colony, when Sabah and Sarawak were transferred to Malaya on the 16th of September, they had a change in status as listed in the UN list, but it was not clearly stated what their change of status was. It seems a bit vague because they didn't clearly say that they were incorporated in Malaysia, you see, for some strange reason. And clearly, being transferred to Malaya on the 16th of September only confirms that they were not capable of making the Malaysia Agreement on the 9th of July 1963. So it's just a further fact that confirms the invalidity of the Malaysia Agreement.
I see. And the very last question, there's some comment from academician, okay, those who in academic fields, saying that this agreement is valid until the court says no. And also, I kind of wondering why there are some lawyers, they argue with your opinion but fail to give idea about this MA63. What is your comment about this one?
Well, I think if it depends on the opinion that it may only be supported, by a court decision. Well, certainly that a court decision would confirm whether the Malaysia Agreement is null and void or not. And however, looking at the facts of the case, our conclusion is that the Malaysia Agreement was void because it failed to comply with the principles of treaty making under international law. So it is an obvious conclusion, of course. And if the problem is not that we don't want to get it to the court, the problem is how to get it to the court, you see. So if we can get this issue into the court, we have no doubt at all that a proper court will find that the Malaysia Agreement was invalid. And if you look at the decision in the Chagos case, the court almost unanimously held that the United Kingdom was in full control of the colony of Mauritius at the time, and therefore it could not make a binding international agreement with Mauritius, because Mauritius had no power to make the agreement. So we have gone through the discussion about the difference between a state and a colony, and clearly Sabah and Sarawak were not states because they weren't independent. They were under the control of the British all the time up to 16th of September 1963. So these are obvious facts. And of course, there are people who feel that they haven't actually, there's no one who have actually come and say your arguments are wrong, you know. They're only saying that you got to prove it in court. So in other words, they themselves cannot provide answers to support their feeling or argument that we are wrong. I mean, they didn't say we are wrong. They say you have to prove it in court. But they don't offer any arguments as to why we may be wrong. I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I've been making the same argument since 2013, and no one has come out and say, you are wrong for all these reasons. No one has done that. So, I mean, on the face of it, we, based on the international law principles, we can see that the agreement is invalid. You know, there's no argument about that. In my opinion, you don't even need a court to prove it. It's just invalid. But the thing is, I challenge all the people out there who says, you know, we don't agree with you. You come and give me reasons why I'm wrong. I'm happy to be proved wrong, actually.
So the only way to bring this matter to the court is we have to let ourselves get arrested by
Well,
the
I
police
will,
and we challenge the police.
yes,
Is that the idea?
I'll explain why we need to go to court
Alright.
to establish legally once and for all that the MA63 was invalid. Once we get the decision, we have a very strong argument that the court said so, not just us. I mean, we are right. The court proven us right. So that is I think not just a legal, but also a political importance to do it. However, even if we don't go to court, we have spread the view that the MA63 was invalid, and a lot of people are aware. And of course, there have been no strong argument as to why it is valid. There have been people who argue that, you know, it is endorsed by the United Nations and all that. I don't believe that the United Nations has ever endorsed the MA63 as valid. They have mentioned it in their legal opinion, but they didn't analyze whether the treaty was concluded effectively. By that, it's meant that they have complied with the rules of treaty making under international law.
So that means the document, the MS63 document that has been submitted to the UN is actually a document to say that okay, Sabah and Sarawak join Malaya to form and Malaya change its name to Malaysia.
Well, no, Article 1 of the MA 63 says that the five countries agree to make an agreement which transfer the sovereignty of Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore to the Federation of Malaya.
I see.
They didn't actually say they form Malaysia. It
Is
only
that
says they changed the name to Malaysia.
so? The
So
whole document, the 100 more pages, is actually it's about that transferring
yeah, I
sovereignty.
mean, the whole thing was purely to transfer British control and sovereignty to Malaya. If you, firstly, the agreement says that, right? Secondly, the British passed the Malaysia Act in their parliament to confirm it, and so did the Malayan government pass the Malaysia Act to confirm acceptance of the free territories as part of Malaysia. So there was no actual, in that sense, there was not really any formation. You know, it's purely to admit three members by the transfer by the UK to Malaya.
I see. All right. Okay. Mr. Robert, this is the last question. What is your comment about about this Minister of Hal Ehwal Sabah Sarawak? I mean, what is your comment about um, Dr. Maximus of his latest action about about the member of parliament who raised the concern about the budget and about the Malaysia agreement about the fairness in budget allocations. What is your comment about Dr. Maximus and Uncle Lee? Because in Sabah, this topic is actually quite hot because
Yeah.
people they are so angry.
Hmm.
What about your opinion?
Did he say that we shouldn't question the
Exactly.
issues of development issues?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there is a comment on the internet that he is the minister for sweeping Sabah Sarawak affairs under the carpet. Probably this is a very good description, and a comment also said, let me see, I can't remember the exact word, but they said they call him a useless traitor, um, and demanded, that's right, and demand that he resign. They demand that this useless traitor resign. Well, I'm just quoting from the posters and what they are saying on the internet. But certainly there is a widespread anger, and I believe he has single-handedly uh, what you call inflame a lot of people, and now there are more Sabahans and Sarawak people who want independence because, according to them, they don't want to be, the term Ulun Malaya. I understand it means slave of Malaya. So to them, according to some comment, this minister was wanting only Sabahans and Sarawakians to remain the Ulun Malaya. And
Yes, that's what we can see.
another comment is that he is suffering under the Stockholm syndrome. You know what that
Uh,
means?
what I understand that he's having a mild stroke actually. milestone.
because of he upset other people.
I've no idea about it,
Yeah.
but
But anyway, he had, as someone was saying, he was just showing the Stockholm syndrome, meaning that Sabahans and Sarawakians are victims of Malayanization, but they have come to accept their victimization because they have been influenced by them for so long. You know, they live under the regime for so long. They relates to the question that you asked at the beginning, that asked by someone, that Sabah and Sarawakians accept Malaysia. Well, it's not actually accepting Malaysia, I think. It's more like they have this Stockholm syndrome, which is translated as Ulun Malaya. So their mentality has been changed, you see, and people say this is exactly what this minister for Sabah Sarawak is suffering from, you see.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the things will change very soon because me myself as a young generation, I can't no longer tolerate with this kind of attitude, this kind of personality.
Is
Those
this
leader,
widespread in Sabah?
yes, those leader will be, the people of Sabah will bring those, you know, this ulun will be bring down in the next state election or general election. They like, in a rude word, it's a bunch of idiot, Well, I think that's all for today. We will have this kind of session next week, which we will talk the same topic. I mean, the same topic, but with different issue. Okay. So I will translate the whole things in bahasa. Okay. Okay. Melalui video
Yeah.
live sebentar tadi, melalui live video sebentar tadi, Encik Robert telah berkongsi pandangan tentang perkara perbezaan antara negara dan juga koloni ataupun tanah jajahan. Lepas tu status North Borneo dan Sarawak sebelum 1963, dan juga adakah Sabah dan Sarawak mempunyai kapasiti untuk membuat perjanjian antara bangsa dengan UK dan Malaya. Okey, secara keseluruhan Sabah dan Sarawak ataupun North Borneo pada waktu itu dikenali sebagai North Borneo adalah merupakan koloni, dan koloni tidak mempunyai kapasiti untuk membuat sebarang perjanjian antara bangsa dengan mana-mana negara. Apa yang berlaku pada 9 Julai 1963, apa yang beliau sampaikan itu hanyalah sebagai satu drama untuk memperlihatkan kepada masyarakat antarabangsa bahawa sebuah negara baru terbentuk oleh negara-negara yang mempunyai sama status. Tetapi hakikatnya tidak, sebab dalam dokumen, kolonial dokumen yang beliau katakan, jelas menyatakan bahawa pegawai British mempersoalkan bahawa Sabah dan Sarawak tidak mempunyai kapasiti untuk melakukan sebarang perjanjian antarabangsa, tetapi demi untuk melaksanakan ini operasi kolonialis ataupun operasi penjajahan, dalam erti kata lain, ia perlu dilakukan sebagai hanya sebagai kosmetik ataupun sebagai lakonan umum untuk mengelak daripada kecaman antarabangsa. Jadi status Sabah dan Sarawak sebelum 1963 adalah koloni dan tidak mempunyai kapasiti untuk melakukan sebarang perjanjian. Jadi adakah Malaysia itu sebuah negara baru berdasarkan perbincangan sebentar tadi? Tidak. Ia sangat jelas bukan negara baru, tetapi 16 September 1963 hanyalah hari penjanamaan semula ataupun penjanamaan Malaya kepada Malaysia, dan ia bukanlah satu tarikh yang perlu kita rayakan lagi setelah mengetahui kebenaran ini. Sebelum ini, ya, sebab semua orang termasuk diri saya berfikir bahawa 16 September 1963 adalah sebuah negara baru yang terbentuk, tapi rupanya itu hanyalah hari penjanamaan nama Malaya kepada Malaysia secara rasmi, kerana pada tarikh tersebut Malaya telah menghantar dia punya wakil ke United Nation dengan sepucuk surat menyatakan bahawa Malaya menukar nama kepada Malaysia dengan kemasukan Sarawak, Sabah, Sarawak dan Singapura. Sedangkan kita di Sabah dan Sarawak pada itu kita merayakan ini Malaysia kerana kita dimaklumkan kita membentuk Malaysia, negara baru, tapi rupanya tidak. Jadi inilah apa perkara yang dibincangkan sebentar tadi, dan banyak lagi persoalan-persoalan yang telah dibangkitkan sebentar tadi, tetapi akan dikongsikan melalui artikel yang akan dibuat untuk menerangkan dengan lebih lanjut lagi tentang isi kandungan yang disampaikan melalui video ini. Jadi kita akan berjumpa lagi untuk sesi seterusnya pada minggu hadapan, kerana kami bersetuju bahawa sesi video live ini akan dilakukan setiap minggu. Jadi ini akan membolehkan anda bertanya soalan direct secara langsung kepada Encik Robert, dan beliau akan memberikan penjelasan semampu yang boleh. Kerana apa? Kerana kita Sabah dan Sarawak mau merdeka. Dan untuk Sabah, sertailah perjuangan RSNB kerana kita akan memerdekakan negara Sabah secara sah mengikut saluran perlembagaan dalam tempoh 10 tahun dari sekarang. Sebarkan video ini dan terima kasih semua. Okay, Mr. Robert, thank you so much for your time. So we will talk about this topic next week then. All right.
Thank you all for having me and listening in, and we will talk again surely. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for those who asking question. We really appreciate that. Thank you then. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.